The mountain man standing beside the general store's hitching post noticed the young woman's face flush crimson before she even turned away from the three ladies blocking the wooden sidewalk. Micah Montgomery had ridden into Petaluma, California that April morning in 1876, with nothing more on his mind than restocking his supplies and heading back to his cabin in the hills. But something about the way those well-dressed women circled their prey made his jaw tighten, and his massive hands curl into fists at his sides. "Patches upon patches," one of the women said loudly enough for half the street to hear. "I suppose some people simply have no pride in their appearance." The young woman they surrounded wore a dress that had clearly seen better days. The fabric, once a soft blue, had faded to something closer to gray, and yes, there were patches covering the elbows and a tear near the hem. But the patches were neat, the stitches small and careful, and the dress itself was clean despite its age. "Mrs. Henderson, please," the young woman said quietly, her voice barely carrying to where Micah stood. "I need to get past." "Oh, we are not stopping you, dear," the woman who must be Mrs. Henderson replied with false sweetness. "We are simply remarking on how unfortunate it is when young women cannot present themselves properly in public. Why, my Charles would never allow his wife to appear in such a state." Micah had spent the last 8 years in the mountains, trapping and hunting, living a life that required muscle and endurance rather than social graces. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer down a mountainside, and arms thick with muscle from swinging axes and hauling timber. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face bore the weathered tan of a man who lived under the open sky. He was not the kind of man who involved himself in town affairs or the petty cruelties of society women. But something about this particular cruelty would not let him walk away. He crossed the dusty street in long strides, his boots making solid sounds on the packed earth. The three women noticed him approaching, and their conversation faltered. Most people in Petaluma knew of Micah Montgomery, if only by reputation. He sold his furs and venison to the trading post, purchased his supplies, and disappeared back into the wilderness. He was polite but distant, powerful but controlled, and definitely not the sort of man to insert himself into a conversation between ladies. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice cutting through their chatter like an axe through kindling. "I could not help but overhear your conversation." Mrs. Henderson drew herself up, clearly ready to put this rough mountain man in his place. "This is a private discussion, Mr. Montgomery." "It stopped being private when you held it in the middle of Main Street," Micah replied evenly. His eyes moved to the young woman they had been tormenting. She was probably 20 or so, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a simple braid and eyes the color of summer grass. Those eyes were wide now, darting between him and the three women with something like panic. "I apologize for interrupting, miss, but I noticed your dress." The young woman's face, already flushed with embarrassment, went even redder. She looked like she wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. "The patches," Micah continued, and Mrs. Henderson made a small sound of triumph that died when he kept talking. "They show real wisdom. A person who knows how to mend and make do, who understands the value of what they have, that is the kind of person who could survive anything. That is the kind of wisdom most folks never learn, no matter how much money they have for new dresses." The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Henderson and her companion stared at him as if he had suddenly started speaking Chinese. The young woman looked equally stunned, but there was something else in her expression now, a glimmer of hope fighting with disbelief. "Well," Mrs. Henderson finally managed, I suppose we cannot expect a man who lives in the wilderness like a savage to understand proper society." "No, madam," Micah agreed without a trace of offense. "I suppose you cannot." He turned his attention fully to the young woman. "Miss, I was about to go into Morrison's store to purchase some fabric. I find myself in need of someone with clear skill in sewing to advise me on what might work best for shirts and such. Would you be willing to help me? I would pay for your time, of course." The young woman's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. Yes, I suppose I could do that." "Much obliged," Micah said. He offered her his arm, a gesture that looked almost comical coming from a man who probably had not escorted a lady anywhere in years. But his manner was sincere, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand on his forearm. The muscle beneath her fingers was solid as oak. They walked past the three women, leaving them sputtering on the sidewalk. Micah did not look back, but he felt the young woman trembling slightly as they climbed the steps to Morrison's general store. Once inside, surrounded by the familiar smells of dried goods and new fabric, she pulled her hand away and turned to face him. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the circles under her eyes, and the way her dress hung a bit too loose on her frame. "You do not need advice on fabric for shirts," she said quietly. "No, miss, I do not," Micah admitted. "But I meant what I said about the patches showing wisdom. And I did not care for the way those women were treating you." Her eyes filled with sudden tears, which she blinked back fiercely. "You should not have done that. They will make things harder for me now." "How could they make things harder?" Micah asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mrs. Henderson's husband owns the boarding house where I rent a room. Her friend Mrs. Talbot runs the dress shop where I was hoping to find work. And the third woman, Mrs. Pierce, her husband is the banker who holds the note on my father's old property." Micah felt his jaw tighten again. "I see." "No, I do not think you do," she said, but her voice was not unkind. "But I thank you anyway. What you said about the patches, about wisdom, that was kind, even if it was not true." "It was true," Micah said firmly. "Every word of it." He glanced around the store, noting that Morrison himself was busy with another customer at the back. "What is your name, Miss?" "Beatrice Garrison," she said. "Most people call me B." "Miss Garrison, I am Micah Montgomery, though you seem to already know that." "Everyone knows the mountain man," B said. "You are something of a legend around here, the man who lives alone in the wilderness, who can track anything, who brought in that massive bear last winter." Micah felt uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "I do what I need to survive, same as anyone." "Not the same as everyone," B countered. "Most people could not survive a week doing what you do." Before Micah could respond, Mr. Morrison approached them, wiping his hands on his apron. "Micah, good to see you. What can I do for you today?" "I need fabric," Micah said, making his decision in that instant. "Good sturdy fabric, suitable for a lady's dress, and thread, needles, anything else needed for sewing." B made a small sound of protest, but Micah continued. "Miss Garrison here has agreed to make me some shirts, and I figure it is only fair to pay her in fabric as well as coin." It was a transparent excuse, and they all knew it. But Morrison was a good man who had seen Mrs. Henderson and her friends in action before. He nodded seriously. "Well, that makes sense. Beatrice here does beautiful work. My wife still talks about the christening gown be made for our youngest." "I could not," B started to say, but Micah cut her off gently. "You could and you will. Consider it payment in advance for the shirts." He turned to Morrison. "Show us what you have." For the next 30 minutes, Morrison pulled down bolts of fabric while B stood rigid with embarrassment and something else Micah could not quite name. He let her choose, noting that she gravitated toward the practical rather than the pretty, selecting sturdy cotton in a warm brown and a dark green that would not show dirt easily. "That green would bring out your eyes," Micah said without thinking. Bee looked at him sharply, surprised. Then, for the first time since he had seen her, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and uncertain, but it transformed her face. "You think so?" "I do," Micah said honestly. In the end, Morrison wrapped up enough fabric for 2 dresses, along with thread, needles, and even some buttons that Bee insisted were too fine. Micah paid without flinching at the price, though it took a sizable chunk of the money he had gotten from his last fur sale. As they left the store, Bee carrying the wrapped package like it was made of gold, she turned to him. "I will make you shirts. I truly will. I will not take this without giving something in return." "All right," Micah agreed. "But first tell me, have you eaten today?" The question clearly caught her off guard. That is not your concern. That is not an answer." When she did not respond, Micah sighed. "There is a restaurant down the street. Let me buy you lunch." "I cannot," Bee said quickly. "People will talk." "People are already talking," Micah pointed out. "Might as well give them something worth talking about." Bee bit her lip, clearly torn. Then her stomach made a small growling sound that decided the matter. "Just lunch," she said. "And then I am going home to start your shirts." "Just lunch," Micah agreed, though he was already planning to order enough food to send some home with her. The restaurant was a modest establishment called Martha's Kitchen, run by a widow named Martha Green who had no patience for gossip or social hierarchies. She greeted them with a warm smile and led them to a table by the window. "I want 2 of your lunch specials," Micah said, "and a basket of your bread to start." When Martha left, Bee looked at him across the table. "You do not have to do this." "I know," Micah said. "I want to." "Why?" The question was simple, but the confusion behind it ran deep. Micah took his time answering. "I have lived alone for 8 years. I have seen a lot in that time. Mountains and valleys, storms and clear skies, animals in their natural state. Nature does not care about patches or new dresses. It cares about survival, about strength, about wisdom. When I saw you standing there in a clean, carefully mended dress while those women in their fancy clothes said cruel things, I saw someone strong. Someone who has been through hard times and survived. That is worth more than all the new fabric in Morrison's store." Bee's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she let them fall. "You do not know anything about me." "Then tell me," Micah said simply. And she did. Over bread and stew and coffee, Beatrice Garrison told her story. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving her with a small piece of land and more debts than assets. She had sold everything she could to pay off what she owed, but it had not been enough. The land was going to be foreclosed on in a matter of months. She had been trying to find work, any work, but the good women of Petaluma had decided that a young woman alone was either a threat or someone beneath their notice. The few jobs available to respectable women had been denied to her through whispered campaigns and closed doors. "I have been living on next to nothing," she admitted. "I take in mending when I can get it, but it is not enough. I have been trying to save enough to leave Petaluma to go somewhere I could start fresh, but every time I get close, something happens. The rent increases, or I get sick and have to buy medicine or something else." "What about family?" Micah asked. "None living," Bee said quietly. "It was just my father and me for as long as I can remember. My mother died when I was born." Micah felt something twist in his chest. He knew what it was like to be alone, but he had chosen his solitude. Bee had not chosen hers. "What about you?" Bee asked, clearly wanting to change the subject. "Why does a man live alone in the mountains for 8 years?" Micah had not talked about his past in longer than he could remember. But there was something about this woman, about the way she had opened up to him, that made him want to be equally honest. I was not always a mountain man, he said. 8 years ago, I was engaged to be married. Her name was Sarah, and I thought I loved her. I had a job working for her father's freight company, and I was saving up to buy us a house. Then one day I came back early from a run and found her with someone else. Another man. One of her father's business partners. B reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. I am sorry. It was a long time ago, Micah said. But it taught me something. It taught me that society, with all its rules and expectations, does not always reward good behavior or punish bad. Sarah married that man a month after she broke our engagement. Last I heard, they were living in San Francisco, very happy in their big house. So you left civilization behind, B said. I did, and I have not regretted it. The mountains do not lie. They do not pretend to be something they are not. If you are not strong enough, smart enough, careful enough, the mountains will kill you. But if you are, they will give you everything you need. That sounds lonely, B observed. It is, Micah admitted, but it is honest. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the dinner rush starting to fill the restaurant around them. Martha brought more coffee and gave Micah an approving nod that he pretended not to see. I should go, B said finally. I want to start cutting the fabric while there is still good light. Let me walk you home, Micah offered. B hesitated, then nodded. All right. The boarding house where B lived was on the edge of town, a shabby building that had seen better days. Micah walked her to the door, very aware of the curtains twitching in windows as they passed. Thank you, B said, turning to face him on the sagging porch, for everything. For what you said about the patches, for the fabric, for lunch, for listening. You did not have to do any of that. I wanted to, Micah said again. He found himself reluctant to leave, which was unusual for a man who typically could not wait to get back to his solitary cabin. When do you think the shirts will be ready? B smiled, and he realized she had seen right through his excuse to see her again. Come back in a week. I will have measurements to take anyway. I need to make sure they fit properly. A week then, Micah agreed. He touched the brim of his hat and turned to go, but her voice stopped him. Micah, he turned back. Those women, Mrs. Henderson and the others, they really will make trouble for me now. Let them try, Micah said, and there was steel in his voice. You are stronger than they are. Your patches prove it. He left her standing on the porch, clutching her package of fabric, and walked back to where he had left his horse tied outside the general store. He had planned to head back to his cabin that afternoon, but now he found himself checking into the small hotel on Main Street instead. He told himself it was because it was getting late, that he did not want to ride the mountain trails in the dark. But the truth was, he was not ready to leave Petaluma just yet. Over the next week, Micah found excuses to stay in town. He needed new boots, he told himself, even though his current ones were fine. He needed to discuss prices with the man who bought his furs, even though they had already settled on terms. He needed to check on his horse, even though the stable owner assured him the animal was perfectly content. What he really needed was to know that Beatrice Garrison was all right. He saw her twice in passing. Once at the general store, where she was buying thread and gave him a small wave that made his heart do something strange in his chest. Once at the pump in the town square, where she was filling a bucket and looked so tired he almost went to her. But she had her pride, and he understood that. So he just nodded and watched her walk away, noting the way other women gave her a wide berth. On the 7th day, he went to the boarding house as promised. Mrs. Henderson herself answered the door, her face pinched with displeasure. Mr. Montgomery, she said coldly, what can I do for you? I am here to see Miss Garrison, Micah said politely. She is making some shirts for me. Miss Garrison is not receiving visitors, Mrs. Henderson said. It would not be proper. Then I will wait here while someone fetches her, Micah said, planting himself on the porch like a tree. "I am a patient man." They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Mrs. Henderson sniffed and turned away. "I will tell her you are here. But you will meet in the parlor with the door open." "That is acceptable," Micah agreed. The parlor was a stuffy room filled with furniture that had been fashionable 30 years ago. Micah stood by the window, too restless to sit, until Bea appeared in the doorway. She looked even thinner than she had a week ago, and there were shadows under her eyes that had not been there before. "What happened?" he asked immediately. Bea glanced at the doorway, where Mrs. Henderson was undoubtedly listening. "Nothing. Everything is fine. I have your shirts ready for a fitting." She had a bundle under her arm, wrapped in brown paper. When she unwrapped it, Micah saw 2 shirts made from sturdy blue fabric he did not remember purchasing. These were not the shirts made from the fabric he had bought her. He opened his mouth to point this out, then understood. She had made him shirts from fabric she already owned, saving the good fabric he had given her for her own dresses. Stubborn, proud woman. "They look fine," he said carefully, "but I need to try them on to be sure they fit." "Oh," Bea said, flushing. "Of course, I will just—" She gestured vaguely. "Turn around," Micah suggested. "I will tell you when I am decent." She spun to face the wall while he stripped off his worn shirt and pulled on one of the new ones. The fit was perfect, the fabric soft from washing but still strong. The stitches were small and even, the work of someone who took pride in what they did. "You can look now," he said. Bea turned and examined him critically. She stepped closer, tugging at the shoulders, checking the length of the sleeves. This close, he could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. "It fits well," she said. "Try the other one." They repeated the process with the second shirt. As Micah was buttoning it up, he saw her sway slightly on her feet. "When did you last eat?" he asked sharply. "I am fine," Bea said automatically. "That was not what I asked." He was already reaching for his original shirt, pulling it on. "Come on, we are going to get you some food." "I cannot," Bea said. "Mrs. Henderson said if I left with you again, she would raise my rent." "Then she can raise it," Micah said. "How much is your rent?" Bea told him, and he pulled out enough money to cover 2 months. "Where is Mrs. Henderson?" "Micah, no," Bea protested. But he was already striding into the hall where the boarding house owner was indeed lurking. "Mrs. Henderson," he said pleasantly. "I believe there has been some concern about Miss Garrison's rent. This should cover the next 2 months. Mrs. Henderson looked at the money, then at him, her expression calculating. 3 months' rent in advance would be more appropriate given the circumstances. "What circumstances?" Micah asked, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "A young woman living alone, entertaining male visitors, Mrs. Henderson said primly. "It raises questions about propriety. The only improper thing I see here is a landlady trying to extort extra money from a tenant," Micah said. 2 months' rent. Take it or Miss Garrison will find better lodging elsewhere." They both knew that better lodging was not available in Petaluma, not for a young woman with no family and no money. But Mrs. Henderson also knew that Micah Montgomery could afford to make good on his threat, could rent Bea a house of her own if he chose to. 2 months will be acceptable," she said, snatching the money. "For now." Micah turned back to Bea, who was standing in the parlor doorway with an expression caught between gratitude and horror. "Get your shawl. We are going to lunch." This time they went to the hotel restaurant, which was nicer than Martha's kitchen and far more public. Micah ordered steak and potatoes and vegetables, ignoring Bea's protests that it was too much. "You are going to eat," he said firmly. "Then we are going to talk." "About what?" Bea asked, but she was already cutting into the steak with an eagerness that betrayed her hunger. "About what you want," Micah said. "Not what you think you can get or what you think you deserve. What you actually want." Bee chewed slowly, thinking. I want to leave Petaluma, she said finally. I want to go somewhere where nobody knows me, where I do not have to be the poor orphan girl in the patched dress. I want to make dresses for people who will appreciate them. I want a place of my own, even if it is just one room. I want to not be hungry all the time. What if you could have all of that without leaving? Micah asked. That is impossible, Bee said flatly. Not in this town, not with women like Mrs. Henderson controlling everything. What if you did not have to worry about women like Mrs. Henderson? Micah pressed. What if you had your own place, your own money, your own life? Bee set down her fork and looked at him directly. What are you suggesting? Micah had been asking himself the same question all week. The answer had become clearer with each passing day, until now it seemed like the most obvious thing in the world. Marry me, he said. The words hung in the air between them. Bee stared at him like he had spoken in a foreign language. What? She finally managed. Marry me, Micah repeated. I have a cabin in the mountains, good land, everything we would need. You could sew there as easily as you do here, maybe better. I sell furs and venison in 4 different towns. You could sell dresses the same way. You would not be hungry. You would not have to worry about rent or landladies or society women. You would be free. You do not know me, Bee said weakly. We have known each other for a week. I know you are strong, Micah said. I know you are proud, maybe too proud for your own good. I know you are skilled with a needle and not afraid of hard work. I know you have been hurt by this town and the people in it. That is more than I knew about Sarah when I proposed to her, and that would have been a disaster even if she had not cheated on me. This is insane, Bee said, but there was something in her eyes that was not quite refusal. Maybe, Micah agreed. But is it any more insane than staying here, slowly starving while you wait for women who hate you to decide your fate? You are talking about a marriage of convenience, Bee said slowly. A practical arrangement. I am talking about a partnership, Micah corrected. I am alone because I choose to be, but that does not mean I like it. You are alone because you have no choice, and I can see that it is killing you. We could help each other. And what would you get out of this? Bee asked. Besides someone to make your shirts, Micah smiled slightly. Company, conversation, someone to share the work and the rewards, maybe eventually more than that, but I would not push. We would take whatever time you needed. You are serious, Bee said, and it was not a question. I am, Micah confirmed. Think about it. You do not have to answer right now. But Bee was already shaking her head. If I think about it, I will talk myself out of it. I will find 100 reasons why it is a bad idea, why it cannot work, why I should stay here and keep trying to make a life in this town that does not want me. She took a deep breath. So I am not going to think about it. I am going to say yes. Micah felt his heart leap in a way he had not experienced in 8 years. You are sure? No, Bee said honestly. But I am sure that staying here will destroy me eventually. And I am sure that you are the first person in 2 years who has looked at me like I am a human being instead of a problem to be solved or an object of pity. So yes, I will marry you, Micah Montgomery. They were married 3 days later by the circuit judge who happened to be passing through Petaluma. Micah bought Bee a simple gold ring from the jeweler, and she wore one of the new dresses she had made from the fabric he had given her. The green one, which did indeed bring out her eyes. The only witnesses were Morrison from the general store and Martha from the restaurant. Mrs. Henderson and her friends were conspicuously absent, though Micah had made sure word of the wedding spread through town. He wanted everyone to know that Beatrice Garrison was now Beatrice Montgomery, and under his protection. After the brief ceremony, they loaded Bee's few possessions onto a wagon Micah had bought for the purpose. It did not take long. She had so little, Some clothes, her sewing supplies, a few books, and a locket that had belonged to her mother. As they prepared to leave Petaluma, several people came to say goodbye. Morrison and his wife, Martha, even a few women who had been kind to Bea when others were cruel. But most of the town watched in silence as the mountain man and his new bride drove away toward the hills. The journey to Micah's cabin took most of the day. The wagon road gave way to a rough trail, which eventually became little more than a path through the trees. Bea did not complain, though Micah could see her gripping the wagon seat as they climbed higher into the mountains. "It is not much further," he said as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. "I am all right," Bea assured him, though her knuckles were white. The cabin came into view as they rounded a bend. It was larger than Bea had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Behind it, she could see a barn and a shed, and beyond that, a creek sparkled in the fading light. "It is beautiful," she said, and meant it. Micah helped her down from the wagon, his large hands spanning her waist easily. For a moment, they stood close together, and Bea was very aware that they were married now, that this man was her husband, that they were about to spend their first night alone together. "I will show you around," Micah said, stepping back to give her space. "Then we should get some supper started." The cabin's interior was neat and well-maintained, if sparse. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies. A ladder led to a loft where Micah apparently slept, and off to one side was a smaller room with a real bed frame, though no mattress. "I have been sleeping in the loft," Micah explained. "I thought you might want the bedroom. I can make a mattress, or we can bring the one from the loft down here." "Where would you sleep?" Bea asked. "The loft, or I can make a bedroll by the fire," Micah said. "Whatever makes you comfortable." Bea looked at this man who had married her, who had given her away out of Petaluma, who was now offering to sleep on the floor so she would feel safe. "We are married," she said quietly. "We can share the bed if you want to." "I want to," Micah said, his voice rougher than usual. "But only if you are sure." "There is no rush, Bea. We have all the time in the world. I am sure," Bea said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. That night, they worked together to move the mattress down from the loft and make up the bed with clean sheets Micah had purchased in town. They cooked supper together, venison stew with vegetables from the root cellar, and ate by lamplight at the sturdy table. "This is strange," Bea said as they washed the dishes together. "A week ago I did not know you existed. Now we are married." "Do you regret it?" Micah asked. Bea considered the question seriously. "No, I am terrified, but I do not regret it. What about you?" "Not even a little bit," Micah said, and the certainty in his voice made Bea's heart flutter. That night they lay in the bed together, careful not to touch it first. But the mountain nights were cold, even in April, and gradually they moved closer together. Bea found herself with her head on Micah's chest, his arm around her shoulders, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Micah's voice rumbled in his chest, vibrating under her ear. "For seeing me," Bea said. "For seeing past the patches." "The patches were the best part," Micah said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "They showed me who you really are." The next weeks passed in a rhythm that was new to both of them. Micah taught Bea about life in the mountains, how to read the weather, how to tell which plants were safe and which were poisonous, how to listen to the forest. Bea, in turn, made the cabin into a home. She sewed curtains for the windows, made cushions for the chairs, organized the shelves with a system that actually made sense. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Micah learned that Bea sang while she sewed, old songs her father had taught her. He learned that she was afraid of spiders but fascinated by birds. He learned that she had a sharp sense of humor that had been buried under years of hardship, and that when she laughed, really laughed. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. B learned that Micah was gentle despite his size, that his hands could be incredibly tender even as they were incredibly strong. She learned that he read poetry in the evenings, surprising her with his love of Wordsworth and Emerson. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes about his time with Sarah, and that he slept better when she held him. One morning about a month after the wedding, B woke to find Micah already up, standing at the window watching the sunrise. She went to him, and he pulled her against his chest without taking his eyes off the view. "I used to think this was enough," he said quietly. "The mountains, the solitude, the simple life, but now I cannot imagine it without you." B turned in his arms to look up at him. "I never thought I could be happy again after my father died. I thought the best I could hope for was survival. But this, here with you, I am not just surviving. I am living." Micah bent his head and kissed her, and it was not their first kiss, but it was the first one that felt like a promise of forever. That spring turned into summer, and B bloomed like the wildflowers on the mountainside. With regular food and clean air and the absence of constant stress, she gained weight, her face filling out, her body growing stronger. She helped Micah with his work, learning to cure hides and preserve meat, and he helped her set up a real sewing area in the corner of the cabin with good light and space to work. In July, Micah took her down to a town called Santa Rosa, bigger than Petaluma and far enough away that no one knew her story. There, at the general store, B left samples of her work: an embroidered handkerchief, a baby's gown with delicate smocking, a man's shirt with perfect stitching. The store owner was impressed and agreed to sell her items on commission. By August, B was getting regular orders. Women wanted her dresses, her children's clothes, her skill with a needle. The money was not much at first, but it was hers, earned by her own hands, and it made her proud. In September, Micah took her to the high meadows to see the autumn colors. They camped under the stars, making love in their bedroll with the whole sky spread above them, and B felt freer than she had ever been in her life. "I love you," she told him as they lay tangled together afterward. "I do not think I said that yet, but I do. I love you, Micah Montgomery." "I love you too," Micah said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I started loving you the moment you smiled at me in Morrison's store, but I know I loved you when you said yes to marrying me without thinking about it." "That was probably not very wise," B said, smiling. "It was the wisest thing either of us ever did," Micah countered. In October, B realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week to be sure, then told Micah one evening as they sat by the fire. "I think I am with child," she said, the words both terrifying and wonderful. Micah went very still. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" B asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Micah said. "Terrified, amazed, grateful, all of those things. But yes, happy most of all." They spent the winter preparing for the baby. Micah built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there was not a splinter to be found. B sewed tiny gowns and blankets, marveling at how small the clothes were. They argued good-naturedly about names, Micah favoring strong traditional names, B wanting something a bit more unusual. The baby came in May, a month of warm sun and blooming wildflowers. The birth was long and difficult, with only Micah there to help, but in the end, B delivered a healthy baby boy. They named him Matthew after Micah's grandfather, with the middle name Grant for B's father. Holding his son for the first time, Micah felt tears stream down his face. "He is perfect," he said in wonder. "B, he is perfect. He is ours," B said, exhausted but radiant. "Our family." Matthew was a good baby, quiet and watchful like his father. As he grew, it became clear he had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. Micah was a devoted father, patient and loving, and Bee often found them together, the massive mountain man cradling the tiny baby with infinite gentleness. When Matthew was 6 months old, Micah built an addition onto the cabin, giving them more space. He also built Bee a proper sewing room with windows on 2 sides for the best light. "You do not have to do this," Bee protested, though she was clearly delighted. "Yes, I do," Micah said. "Your sewing is bringing in good money now. You deserve a proper place to work." It was true. Word of Bee's skill had spread, and she had orders from 3 different towns now. Women would send measurements and fabric, and Bee would create beautiful clothes that fit perfectly. She had to turn down work sometimes because she could not keep up with demand. "Maybe I should teach someone," Bee mused one evening as she worked on a particularly intricate wedding dress. "Pass on what I know." "That is a fine idea," Micah agreed. He was sitting nearby, mending a leather harness while Matthew slept in his cradle. "You could take on an apprentice." The idea took root, and by the time Matthew was walking, Bee had her first student. A young woman from Santa Rosa named Emily, whose family could not afford to pay much but who had a genuine talent for sewing. Bee taught her twice a week, and in return, Emily helped with the simpler orders. Life settled into a pattern that was rich and full. Micah continued his trapping and hunting, but now he had more reason to come home. Bee continued her sewing, but now she had help and did not have to work herself to exhaustion. Matthew grew strong and healthy, learning to walk and talk, exploring the mountain world around him with fearless curiosity. On their 3rd anniversary, Micah took Bee back to Petaluma. She had not been back since they left, and she was nervous about it. "Why do you want to go there?" she asked as they drove the wagon down the familiar road. "Because I want people to see what you have become," Micah said. "I want those women who shamed you to see the successful businesswoman, the loving wife, the wonderful mother. I want them to see that their cruelty did not break you." They drove straight to Morrison's general store, where Bee left a selection of her finest work. Morrison greeted them warmly, exclaiming over how big Matthew had gotten and how well Bee looked. "You are positively glowing," he said. "Mountain life agrees with you." As they were leaving the store, they nearly ran into Mrs. Henderson. The older woman stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in Bee's fine dress, made by her own hands, the healthy child in her arms, the confident way she stood beside her husband. "Mrs. Montgomery, Mrs. Henderson said stiffly. "What a surprise, Mrs. Henderson," Bee replied with perfect politeness. "How nice to see you again." They stood there for a moment, the tension thick. Then Matthew reached out from Bee's arms and grabbed Micah's finger, babbling happily, and Micah smiled down at his son with such love that it was almost painful to witness. "You seem to have done well for yourself," Mrs. Henderson finally said, and there was something bitter in her tone. "I have been very blessed," Bee agreed. "I have a husband who loves me, a beautiful son, work that I enjoy, and a home that is truly mine. I could not ask for more." "Yes, well," Mrs. Henderson said, clearly uncomfortable. "I suppose sometimes things work out." "They do," Bee said, and her smile was genuine. "When you stop letting other people define your worth." They left Mrs. Henderson standing on the sidewalk and went to have lunch at Martha's kitchen. Martha made a huge fuss over Matthew and beamed at Bee and Micah like a proud aunt. As they drove back to the mountains that evening, Bee looked over at her husband. "Thank you for that," she said, "for giving me the chance to go back on my own terms." "You did not need me for that," Micah said. "You are the one who built this life. I just gave you a safe place to do it." "You gave me more than that," Bee said softly. "You gave me hope. You saw the wisdom in my patches when everyone else saw shame. You changed my whole life with your kindness." "We changed each other's lives," Micah corrected. "I was just existing before you, now I am living." 2 years later, B gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Molly Grace. She had B's honey-colored hair and Micah's strong features, and from the moment she was born, she had her father wrapped around her tiny finger. "I do not stand a chance, do I?" Micah said, holding his daughter while she gripped his finger with her impossibly small hand. "Not even a little bit," B agreed, laughing. Matthew, now a sturdy 3-year-old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He wanted to help with everything, from bathing her to changing her to rocking her cradle. Under B's watchful eye, he learned to be gentle, and Molly would quiet at the sound of her big brother's voice. The cabin was fuller now, louder, messier, and Micah loved every moment of it. He had built more additions, so they now had separate rooms for the children, and he was already planning another expansion for when they got older. "You are planning more children?" B teased him one evening as he showed her the sketches. "I am planning for possibilities," Micah said with dignity, though his eyes were twinkling. "Would you object to more children?" "I would not object," B said, moving into his arms. "Though perhaps we could wait a little while. Molly is quite demanding." "Take all the time you need," Micah said, kissing the top of her head. "I am a patient man." By the time Matthew was 6 and Molly was 3, B had 3 apprentices and a thriving business. Women came from as far as Sacramento to commission her dresses, and she had recently started making men's suits as well. Fine, tailored pieces that fit better than anything available in the stores. Micah's work had also expanded. He had been hired by the territorial government to guide surveying parties through the mountains, work that paid well and used his extensive knowledge of the terrain. Between them, they were making more money than either had ever dreamed of. "We should buy land," B said one evening as they discussed their finances. "Real land with a deed and everything. I do not want our children to ever face what I faced, losing everything because of debt." They bought 200 acres surrounding the cabin, land that had been government territory but was now being opened for homesteading. It was more land than they would ever need, but it was theirs, completely and legally, with papers that said so. On the day they signed the deed, Micah took B to the highest point of their property, a rocky outcrop that looked out over valleys and peaks stretching to the horizon. "This is ours," he said, his arm around her shoulders. "All of it. No one can take it from us." "Our children's inheritance," B said, leaning against him. "A legacy." "More than that," Micah said. "Proof that patches can become something beautiful. You came to me with nothing but a patched dress and more courage than anyone I have ever known. Look what we have built." B turned to face him, her eyes bright with tears. "We built it together. Every bit of it." They kissed there on the mountaintop, with their land spread out below them and the future stretching ahead, full of possibility. Matthew grew into a boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did, who could track animals and read the weather and climb trees with fearless confidence. But he also had his mother's gentle hands and often helped her in the sewing room, showing an unexpected talent for detail work. Molly was all fire and determination, climbing everything, questioning everything, driving Micah to distraction with her fearlessness, and making B laugh with her stubborn insistence on doing things herself. When B told Micah she was pregnant again, he swept her up in his arms despite her protests that she was too heavy, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. This baby came easier than the others, a boy they named Marcus Grant, who had dark hair like his father and brother but B's green eyes. He was a quiet, thoughtful baby who seemed content to watch the world around him with solemn attention. With 3 children, the cabin was full of life and noise and chaos. There were toys scattered on the floor, diapers hanging to dry, small muddy footprints on the porch, and Micah loved every bit of it. He had built a larger barn and taken on more livestock, so they had milk and eggs and meat without having to hunt constantly. He had also built a smokehouse and expanded the root cellar, making them more self-sufficient than ever. Bea had hired a woman from Santa Rosa to help with the children while she worked, and together, they managed the household and the sewing business with surprising efficiency. Orders kept coming in, and Bea had even started shipping her work to San Francisco, where fashionable ladies were willing to pay premium prices for her skill. One evening, when Marcus was almost a year old, Bea sat down with Micah to go over their finances. The numbers were almost unbelievable. Between the sewing business, Micah's guide work and fur sales, and the sale of livestock, they had more money than they could spend. "We should help people," Bea said suddenly. "People like I was, people who need a chance." "What did you have in mind?" Micah asked, though he already approved. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, the one who saw Patches as wisdom and wanted to share that wisdom with others. Over the next year, they established a fund to help young women learn trades. Bea took on more apprentices, teaching them sewing and business skills. Micah hired young men to help with his guide work, teaching them wilderness skills and paying them fair wages. They bought a building in Santa Rosa and turned it into a workshop where Bea's apprentices could work and sell their creations. The venture was successful beyond their wildest dreams. The women Bea trained went on to open their own shops, to support themselves and their families, to build lives of dignity and independence. The young men Micah trained became respected guides and trappers, earning good livings from their skills. And through it all, the Montgomery family grew and thrived. Matthew at 12 was already as tall as his mother, with his father's broad shoulders starting to develop. He had decided he wanted to be a doctor, fascinated by healing and helping people, and Micah and Bea were already planning how to pay for medical school. Molly at 9 was a force of nature, determined to be a guide like her father. She could already track better than most grown men and had no fear of the wilderness. Bea worried about her, but Micah understood. His daughter had the same spirit that had allowed Bea to survive those terrible years in Petaluma, the same courage that made her say yes to marrying a stranger. Marcus at 6 was the quiet one, happiest with a book or watching his mother sew. He had clever fingers and a mind that soaked up information like a sponge. Bea thought he might be a scholar someday, or perhaps an artist. When Matthew was 14, a letter came from a family in Petaluma. It was from Morrison's daughter, asking if Bea would teach her to sew. The letter was polite and desperate in equal measure, explaining that the girl was 18 now and needed a skill to support herself, that her father had suggested she write to the famous Mrs. Montgomery. Bea read the letter 3 times, then showed it to Micah. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to say yes," Bea said slowly, "but I do not know if I can go back to Petaluma even for this." "You do not have to go back," Micah said. "She can come here, we have room." So Morrison's daughter, Clara, came to stay with them for 6 months. She was a sweet girl, eager to learn, and she fit into their household easily. She helped with the younger children, learned to sew with Bea's patient instruction, and blossomed under the warmth of a family who valued her. When she left to return home, she had a full set of skills and a portfolio of work that would let her start her own business. She also had something else, confidence, the knowledge that she could make her own way in the world. "You gave her what you gave me," Bea told Micah after Clara left. "A chance, hope, the belief that Patches can be wisdom. We gave her what we give everyone," Micah corrected. "A fair shake and the tools to succeed, The rest is up to them. That summer, on a trip to San Francisco to deliver a particularly large order, Bea ran into someone she had never expected to see again. Sarah, Micah's former fiancée, now much older and harder looking than the beauty she had been. Sarah recognized Bea from the description she had heard of the famous seamstress everyone was talking about. "You are Beatrice Montgomery," she said, approaching Bea at the hotel. "I am," Bea agreed cautiously. "Montgomery," Sarah repeated, and something clicked in her expression. "Micah. You married Micah." "I did, 8 years ago," Bea said, seeing no reason to lie. Sarah looked at her for a long moment, taking in her fine dress, her confident bearing, the expensive hotel she was staying at. "Is he well?" "Very well," Bea said. "We have 3 children and a good life in the mountains." "3 children," Sarah echoed, and there was something like regret in her voice. "I have none. My husband, well, he is not the man I thought he was." Bea felt a moment of pity for this woman who had thrown away something precious for something shiny. But mostly, she felt grateful. Grateful that Sarah's betrayal had sent Micah to the mountains, where he had been waiting to save a woman in a patched dress. "I hope things improve for you," Bea said sincerely, and walked away without looking back. When she returned home and told Micah about the encounter, he listened quietly. Then he pulled her close and said, "I used to think her betrayal was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Now I know it was the best. It brought me to you." "Everything brought us to each other," Bea said. "The patches, the shame, the cruelty, all of it led to this." As the years passed, the Montgomery children grew into remarkable adults. Matthew went to medical school in San Francisco and became a doctor, eventually returning to the mountains to serve the scattered communities there. He married a teacher and gave Bea and Micah their first grandchildren. Molly became a guide, one of the few women doing such work, and she was better than most of the men. She never married, declaring that the mountains were husband enough for her, but she had a rich life full of adventure and accomplishment. Marcus became a teacher and writer, documenting the stories of the mountain communities and the people who lived there. His books became famous for their compassion and detail, and he married one of Bea's former apprentices, a woman who shared his love of stories. Through it all, Micah and Bea remained at the heart of their family, the foundation on which everything else was built. They had more children, 2 more daughters who grew up strong and capable, and the cabin expanded again and again to accommodate the growing family. On their 20th anniversary, Micah took Bea back to Petaluma one more time. This trip was different, though. They were guests of honor at the town's Founding Day celebration, invited because of their contributions to the region's economy and their charitable work. They drove into town in a fine carriage, dressed in their best clothes. Bea wore a dress she had made herself from the finest fabric, with intricate embroidery that had taken months to complete. Micah wore a suit tailored to fit his still massive frame, his long hair now streaked with silver but his body still strong. The whole town turned out to greet them. Morrison, now elderly but still running his store, embraced Bea like a daughter. Martha, retired from her restaurant, wept with joy at seeing them. Even people who had once shunned Bea now wanted to talk to her, to claim some connection to the famous seamstress and her mountain man husband. Mrs. Henderson was there too, much older now, her sharp edges softened by time and perhaps regret. She approached Bea hesitantly. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said formally, "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you all those years ago. I was cruel and you did not deserve it." Bea looked at this woman who had once made her life miserable, who had charged her too much rent and tried to control her life. She felt nothing but pity. "I forgive you," Bea said simply. "I forgave you a long time ago, Mrs. Henderson. Holding on to that anger would have poisoned the good life I have built." Mrs. Henderson nodded, tears in her eyes. "You have done well. Better than any of us expected." "I had help," Bea said, looking at Micah, who was talking to Morrison across the room. "I had someone who saw wisdom in my patches." That evening, as they drove back to the mountains under a sky full of stars, Micah took Bea's hand. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving civilization, living in the wilderness, all of it?" "Never," Bea said firmly. "Every choice I made led me to you, to our children, to this life. I would not change a single thing." "Not even the patches?" Micah asked with a smile. "Especially not the patches," Bea said. "They taught me that wisdom and strength can look like weakness to people who do not know any better. They taught me that survival is beautiful, and they brought me to you." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horses knowing the way home without much guidance. Then Bea spoke again. "You remember what you said to me that first day, about patches showing wisdom?" "I do," Micah confirmed. "I have been thinking about that a lot lately," Bea said. "About how life is like that dress. We all get torn and worn down by circumstances. We all need mending. The question is whether we have the courage to do the mending ourselves, to take the patches we need and wear them with pride." "That is beautiful," Micah said softly. "It is true," Bea replied. "And it is what I want to teach our grandchildren. Not to hide their tears and patches, but to see them as proof of their survival, their wisdom, their strength." Years later, when Micah and Bea were in their 60s, they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin watching their grandchildren play in the yard. There were 8 of them now, ranging in age from 3 to 15, all strong and healthy and loved. "We did well," Micah said, taking Bea's hand. His hair was completely silver now, but his grip was still strong, his body still powerful despite his age. "We did better than well," Bea corrected, her own hair more gray than honey-colored now, but her eyes still that same vibrant green. "We built something that will last, not just children and grandchildren, but a legacy of kindness, of seeing value where others see weakness, of understanding that patches show wisdom." A young granddaughter, one of Molly's nieces who had come to visit, approached them shyly. She was about 7, with dark hair and a serious expression. "Grandmother," she said, "I tore my dress playing. Mother says she will mend it, but I am sad because it will have a patch." Bea pulled the child onto her lap, feeling the sweet weight of her. "Let me tell you a story," she said, "about a young woman who wore a dress with many patches and how those patches changed her life." As Bea told the story, her voice strong and clear, Micah listened with a smile. He had heard this story many times over the years in different versions and for different audiences, but it never got old. The story of how he had seen a woman being shamed for her patched dress, how he had bought her fabric and told her that patches showed wisdom, and how that act of kindness had grown into a love that had lasted decades. The granddaughter listened with wide eyes, and when the story was done, she looked down at the tear in her dress with new understanding. "So patches are good?" she asked. "Patches are proof that we keep going," Bea said. "That we do not give up when things get hard. That we find solutions and make do and survive. That is wisdom, little one. That is strength." The child nodded seriously, then ran off to play again, the tear in her dress forgotten in her excitement. "Another generation taught," Micah said, pulling Bea against his side. "Another generation who will know their worth," Bea agreed. That night, lying in their bed in the cabin that had grown from a simple bachelor dwelling to a family home, Micah and Bea held each other close. "I love you," Micah said, as he had said countless times over their 25 years of marriage. "From the moment I saw those patches and knew what they meant, I have loved you." "And I love you," Bea replied, "for seeing the wisdom when everyone else saw shame, for giving me a chance when I had no hope, for building this beautiful life with me." They fell asleep in each other's arms as they had done for thousands of nights and would do for thousands more to come. The Montgomery legacy continued through the generations. The land they had purchased remained in the family, passed down from parents to children who understood its value. The workshop Bee had established in Santa Rosa became a thriving business that employed dozens of women, teaching them skills and independence. The charitable fund they had started grew to help hundreds of people build better lives. But more than the money or the land or the businesses, what lasted was the lesson. The understanding that worth is not measured in fine clothes or social status, but in courage, wisdom, and the strength to keep going when life tears you down. The knowledge that patches are not something to hide, but something to wear with pride, because they prove you survived. When Micah passed away at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep with Bee beside him, the whole region mourned. He had been more than a mountain man. He had been a teacher, a guide, a father figure to dozens of young men who had learned wilderness skills from him. He had been a husband who had loved his wife with unwavering devotion for over 30 years. He had been a man who saw value where others saw shame, who understood that true wisdom often came in patched packages. Bee lived for another 5 years after Micah's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She continued to sew almost until the end, her hands still sure with a needle even as her body failed. She taught her great-grandchildren the same lessons she had taught everyone else. That survival is beautiful, that wisdom comes from hardship, and that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. On the day Bee died, at the age of 80, she was wearing a dress she had made herself. It was beautiful, made from the finest fabric with perfect stitches and elegant lines. But sewn into the lining, invisible to everyone but her, was a single patch. A piece of faded blue fabric from her old dress, the one she had been wearing the day Micah Montgomery looked at her and saw wisdom instead of shame. Her children found it when they were preparing her for burial, and they understood. That patch was a reminder, a tribute, a symbol of everything she and Micah had built together. It was proof that the girl in the patched dress had survived, had thrived, had created a legacy that would last for generations. They buried Bee beside Micah on their land, on the high point where he had once told her they had built something beautiful from patches and courage. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered there, dozens of people whose lives had been shaped by the love between a mountain man and a woman in a patched dress. And if you visit that spot today, you will find a simple stone marker with their names and dates, and beneath that, an inscription chosen by their eldest son, Matthew. Here lie Micah and Beatrice Montgomery. They taught us that patches show wisdom, that love can transform everything, and that the strongest foundations are built on kindness and courage. Their legacy lives on in all who knew them. The land around the grave is still Montgomery land, kept in the family and protected by their descendants. The cabin, expanded and improved but still recognizable, is now a museum that tells the story of the mountain man and his bride. Visitors come from all over to see the place where a simple act of kindness, a few words about patches and wisdom, grew into a love story that changed countless lives. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blows just right through the mountain passes, people swear they can hear the sound of laughter, the voices of a man and a woman who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that has lasted far beyond their own lives. They hear the wisdom in the wind, the knowledge that true worth has nothing to do with fine clothes or social status, and everything to do with courage, love, and the strength to keep patching the tears life gives us until we create something beautiful. The story of Micah and Beatrice Montgomery became legend in California, passed down through generations as a reminder that kindness matters, that seeing value in others can change the world, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories start with the simplest gestures. A mountain man who saw wisdom in patches, a woman who had the courage to say yes to hope, and a life built together that proved love, real love, can overcome anything. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in the region, still tell the story, still understand the lesson. When they see someone struggling, someone dismissed or shamed or overlooked, they remember Micah looking at Bee's patched dress and seeing not poverty but wisdom. They remember Bee taking a leap of faith with a stranger and finding her forever. And they try to live up to that legacy, to see the patches in others and recognize them for what they truly are. Proof of survival, symbols of wisdom and opportunities for love to bloom. The end.